by the way, on the issue of developments around that nuclear power plant. Yesterday, we were telling you about a fire that broke out at a training facility adjacent to the plant. Russia has denied the claims, reports by Ukraine, that it is to blame for the fire and the shooting that went on there between the two rival sides. Let's talk more then about what's happened in the last 12 hours or so. We're joined tonight by Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. She's CEO of the South African Institute of International Affairs. And Elizabeth, a very good evening. Welcome to the program. I suppose a real pity that we're already hearing of violations to the ceasefire agreement barely a day into it.
Yes, no, clearly one of the biggest issues that, I think Ukraine is facing 10 days into the war is the humanitarian catastrophe. And clearly the ceasefire was focused really on two key cities in the south of Ukraine, of which Mariupol is the very strategic city on the Sea of Azov. There have been different narratives that have been coming out that said there have been violations by the Russians or violations by the Ukrainians, but the fact of the matter is that people have not been able to be evacuated from the city. So the city, both cities have significant civilian populations that are living in bunkers, that are, as you said, no electricity, no water, etc. And I think what is, if we look at what we need to focus on going forward as an international community, I think we really need to give any manner of diplomacy a chance and to see what we can do in terms of, and this is not just the warring parties. In fact, when you have warring parties, you need others who are not directly involved to actually help to really de-escalate, to bring cool heads to the discussions, and to try in the first instance to deal with the humanitarian catastrophe, to very importantly deal with nuclear safety issues, because an incident can happen. It might not be intentional, but it can happen. And we saw what you've just reported on. And then to really look, I think, importantly, at a cessation of hostilities across all fronts, not just in sort of two cities, to give negotiations a chance, to give diplomacy a chance, even if at this particular juncture it might seem like, really far from possible.
And just on the point that you were making about how no sooner have you heard a claim by the Ukrainians or the Russians, is there a counter-narrative being formed? How do those of us who are observing from a distance make head or tail of the situation?
I think that's always the big challenge when you're in a war situation. This is not a particular characteristic of the current conflict. There is value to both sides to push. If there are huge Russian casualties from the Russian side, it doesn't make sense to advertise them, but the Ukrainians may wish to do so. If there is a violation, clearly, if you want to show that you've been complying and therefore you have the moral high ground, you're going to make that case. I think it's important for both analysts and journalists and everybody else who's watching it, really to be actually exposed and to follow things across multiple sources. I think it is important to hear some of the stories of people on the ground, civilians who are fleeing. But it's very difficult. You know what they say about the truth being the first victim in a conflict situation. But somewhere in between, I think, you find a via media.
And we're just reporting that we're now learning that the Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, has in fact just concluded a 3-hour meeting in Moscow with Vladimir Putin. You were just referring to how we need some sort of mediation, in South African speak, to resolve this situation. Who are the honest parties who can do that? Because largely, all the countries that are part of the EU, the Americans, they've been ruled out at this stage, aren't they?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think in a situation like this, we need to look at every possible avenue, including every possible instrument that one can use to advance diplomacy. And so some may decide, there needs to be a conversation at the UN Security Council, like you referred, around humanitarian corridors and humanitarian issues. Others might think that an individual country or groups of countries may believe that if they have a particularly good relationship or open relationship with one of the sides, that they can perhaps also make openings for discussions around, really, as I said, in the very first phase, just de-escalating and almost looking at focusing on cessation of hostility. I think, if we look at the South African statement that came after the vote at the UN General Assembly, we made the point about the importance of looking for diplomatic solutions. And I think even South Africa, with its experience, we probably have not as much leverage as perhaps others, but certainly with our history of mediation and conflict resolution, I'm not suggesting we do it on our own, and I don't think that's the case. But I think we need to reach out to various parties to see how each of us, with our particular strengths and particular leverage points, might be able to bring some reason to what's happening. Because as you said, European Union, NATO, Russia, Ukraine, these are parties that need to really be encouraged to de-escalate, not to be, it's going to be difficult for them to be mediating.
Is it possible, though, for any country that would want to step in outside, as you're saying, the framework of the EU or even the NATO formation itself, is it really possible for any country to come in as completely neutral, because that appears to be what people are seeking?
It's always difficult, for somebody to be absolutely, completely neutral. One party might see an abstention by a particular country as indicating that it is against it and so on. So that's why I'm saying it's not necessarily just one actor here, but certainly a group of, I think there needs to be an approach that is collective, that identifies that perhaps Israel, and in the case of Naftali Bennett, might be able to be seen as one such party, but you might want to bring somebody else into the discussions that perhaps brings a particular perspective and a particular experience and a particular respect from both parties that can help to move the process forward. It's really difficult because also the narrative has become so polarized, and and Russia has become so isolated by so many countries in the world that to identify these, but I think it's possible. And I think the fact that Naftali Bennett was in Moscow today speaking to Putin is a positive step.
Very quickly then, AFP is reporting that a Ukrainian source, a negotiator, in fact they're saying, has now said that a third round of talks will take place between Russia and Ukraine on Monday. But what hope is there for success when fighting on the ground is still so rampant?
I think that's the issue here, which is why I made the point that it is so important that if we're talking about diplomacy, to give diplomacy a chance, we actually need to stop fighting. And even if that is a temporary respite, to allow negotiators, possibly with the mediator, to actually go into these meetings not feeling that you're negotiating with a gun to your head, or feeling that depending on which side is winning where, that's all. We've seen that in so many wars. We saw that in the wars in Yugoslavia, where sometimes the negotiation would be used as an opportunity to gain time and to gain territory. That's a problem. That's not sincere and effective negotiations. But clearly, I would argue that the first step to really meaningful and sustainable negotiations are indeed a cessation of hostilities. And I just want to make one last point, Debekile, if I may. I think this is so important for all of us, meaning countries across the world that are not directly involved, to actually make a contribution, because I think the implications for the rest of the world, economically, developmentally, if you just think of the climate crisis, if you just think of the sustainable development agenda, if you have mass devastation, and including significant effects on Europe and the US. These are the countries that are also, some of the biggest financiers or catalysts for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think we will all suffer.
Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, thank you very much for your time. Elizabeth is the CEO of the South African Institute for International Affairs, speaking to us about the invasion of Ukraine.